about tech for good, we want to know exactly what does that mean, because right now I don't know what that means. So I'm just as curious as you are, the audience, about what that means. We're going to bring out two panelists to give us some insights on exactly what tech for good means, what shapes that, what drives that, where does that end up, and who knows, maybe we'll have an army rather than an audience by the end of the discussion. My first panelist, he's going to walk out in a moment, is Jeremy Ford. He is Director of Dell Giving with Dell's CSR team. He's passionate about applying Dell's technology to the company's philanthropy and working closely with the business. So, Jeremy's real tall, so I hope he didn't hit his head.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Good morning.
All right.
How you doing?
All right. Good to have you. That's it. And we also have Ettore Rossetti. He is Senior Director of Social Business Strategy and Innovation at Save the Children, one of the earliest adapters of social media in a nonprofit setting at Save the Children, projecting its brand into a leading presence among their peers. And he began the multi-million-dollar initiative called Be a Life Force, which encourages video gamers, streamers, and vloggers to pledge to fundraise on behalf of charity. Ettore? Where's Ettore? There he is. Thank you, sir. All right. Good. So I wanted to take a moment or a few moments for you two to sort of introduce yourselves and
Sure.
sort of give some opening remarks on your thoughts about good for tech, exactly what that means.
Yeah.
Let's start. Yeah, Jeremy.
All right. So I'm Jeremy Ford with Dell, as Charles mentioned. I'm an electrical engineer by background, and just recently actually led our cloud services business globally. But then about 6 months ago, took over responsibility for Dell Giving. And so, one of the reasons why I was so excited about kind of taking a little bit of a career left turn and getting into giving is because I don't think the question for Dell is whether or not we believe that technology can be used for good. We think that's more of a statement. The real opportunity for us is how do we maximize the kind of compounding positive impact that technology can enable and that we can kind of enable together. And so for us, it's a matter of how do we kind of work together, how do we kind of innovate around technology. And we really believe that technology and human progress are at an intersection. And we think that this whole digital business transformation that we see in multiple verticals can be applied for good as well. And it's a matter of how do we work together to kind of maximize that benefit. And so excited to be here this morning.
Excellent. Excellent. Ettore?
I've been with Save the Children for 11 years. Save the Children has been around for nearly 100 years, serving kids in 120 countries, including the United States. And we give kids a healthy start, the opportunity to learn, and protection from harm every day and in times of crisis. As a father, I take the mission personally. I empathize with the children's plight in the developing world because I have two kids who've grown up over the past decade while I've been at Save the Children. And on a personal note, I am a Guinness World Record holder for the longest tennis volley, a story for another time. That's me and my identical twin brother. I'm the one with the mustache.
All right. I'm glad you threw that in there.
Yeah.
You were talking about that earlier.
Just gonna leave him hanging.
Like 5.5 hours? Right. Five and a half hours of the time.
People can ask it in the Q&A.
I don't know how you do that.
All right.
Let's just talk about that. So I want to ask you both, want to just sort of open it up, and we're going to open it up later for questions to the audience. I know those will be flowing soon. Talk about tech for good. Okay, so right now it's just this kind of huge, kind of generic term at the moment for me. And I'm just curious, I want to get your thoughts on what exactly is tech for good? What do you think that means? What do you visualize when you hear that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start, and I think it's really around kind of a few different aspects. I think that one of the things that you'll see, and I think that Tori will talk about this morning, is just kind of the ability that you can use technology to kind of transform sympathy, awareness, kind of what Gina was talking about, to empathy, where you now can kind of connect more to a particular issue, whether that's through Save the Children. There's a virtual reality experience out in the cafeteria that we worked on with Adrian Grenay and the Lonely Whale Foundation that talks about kind of ocean health, and so you can kind of help use technology to really connect people closer to a particular issue. I think secondly, and we take this for granted, but the amount of collaboration that we can drive globally to kind of partner, whether it's an individual level, at a corporate level, to really kind of drive impact, because I think one of the key things that we see is that you can't go alone in a lot of these initiatives, and that the more that we can enable collaboration, the more that we can bring in a diverse set of companies, individuals, et cetera, and technology is one of the key enablers to that. And then the third area that we think about is really around, what we kind of generically call R&D for good. And I kind of mentioned in the introduction, but we see a lot of digital transformation in healthcare and financial services and retail, how you connect with customers, how you collaborate with other partners. And we think that the same transformation that technology is enabling in those areas can be kind of used where we take true innovation, true R&D, and really drive an impact in some of the social areas. And so when we think about technology for good, those are kind of the three areas that we think about.
Tori?
We look at tech for good from a kid's perspective. And technology innovation is real important. We think it could advance and accelerate our mission and our ambition over the next 15 years to accomplish three breakthroughs. Number one, that every child has a healthy start in life and no child dies of a preventable or treatable cause like diarrhea, malaria, pneumonia before age 5. Number two, that every child has access to a quality education. And number three, that violence against children is not tolerated. Those are the three breakthroughs, and we think that technology can create connections and empathy so that we can widen the pie of how many people are actually giving to philanthropy.
Mm-hmm. I hear this term a lot, and I know a lot of folks in this room and folks who are watching hear this term disruption. And to some folks, particularly in the innovation sector, that sounds very exciting. To others, it might sound really ominous. You disrupt.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, just because a technology is disruptive, does that necessarily make it good? Because there's this assumption that anything that's disruptive, it's got to be good, because if it's disruptive, it's more efficient, it's more effective, it has more lasting power, more efficacy. Is that the case, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think that what's exciting as far as when we talk about kind of this third platform that things like cloud, mobility, social media, big data, or analytics enable, is that it really kind of helps empower ideas from anyone and from anywhere. And whether you're a small social entrepreneur, whether you're a large organization, I think that the disruption that those technologies enable and the access they provide, the capabilities that you have access now to, as an individual, as a small company, as a large organization, are really unparalleled from what you've had before. It used to be you had to have tons of capital and a lot of infrastructure to really kind of drive change, get access to key technologies, and that democratization has kind of happened to the point now where I think that what's exciting is you can see disruption from any sector. And I think that we've seen examples of where very small organizations can disrupt very kind of established verticals, and whether that's in the Uber and the taxis and those kind of pieces, or other companies have been able to do that, Spotify, et cetera. I think that's where I think the excitement of disruption is in tech for good, is that innovation can come from multiple areas and not just a select few organizations.
That could be a fascinating discussion, because you're kind of coming from the corporate perspective,
right,
working for Dell, nonprofit perspective. So, Tori, when you hear disruption, and you're in that nonprofit sector, how does that strike you?
I think disruption can be a force for good, especially around innovation. One example I'll give.
It's all semantics.
That's right.
Disruption. Go ahead.
And live streaming, right? So think about television and think about the evolution of live streaming. Live streaming for a nonprofit can bring the donor closer to the field and the field closer to the donor right now in real time. And even more, it can create a connection with the beneficiaries on the ground, right? And I've got a photo of a story I got to share.
Yeah, sure.
That basically we had a live stream, and these two girls are representative of girls that may not be noticed. They're not on television, they're not front page news, yet how can we transform sympathy for their plight of being hungry, malnourished, and being thirsty right? This shows a picture of 6-year-old Sophia carrying her 2-month-old daughter, a sister, on her back. And she's walking across a desert with no shoes to get to water, right? And imagine if that were you. Imagine if that was your child. It's hard to imagine, so you don't imagine it. But what if we use technology to connect you with a live stream, as you see here? And this is a live stream in Dadaab, Kenya, at the time the largest refugee camp in the world. And we connected a legion of gamers, Athene and his community, to a child on the ground, 9-year-old Wasame. And they could ask questions in the chat room, what it's like to be a child, what it's like to live in a refugee camp. Now you're creating an instant connection between the child and the audience. And that's what's important, and that could be transformative around a disruptive innovation like live streaming.
All right. We have some questions. I have a lot of questions, actually, from those of you in the audience, so I want to go ahead and bridge to those. Jeremy, there's a question for you. You mentioned maximizing the compounding impact of technology for good. And the person here is asking, can you give a tangible example of how Dell is doing this?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a few ways. I think one is one of the things that we've actually a part of is called the Net Positive Project, which is around understanding, first of all, what is Dell's footprint through our supply chain of the resources that we consume. So we've actually measured the amount of annual, basically carbon dioxide equivalent that Dell as a corporation and for operations represents. About 14.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide is our footprint. And so what we're basically then looking at is, but if you take like the benefit of what we're doing around connected workforce, so about 25% of Dell employees today are all remote. Actually, if you look at a study that we just recently announced, it actually shows like 45% at any one time are actually working remotely, and that ends up saving about 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide for each employee that works remotely. And we're beginning to kind of look at, okay, so we know that what our footprint is, but then how do we begin to use our technology both within Dell and then beyond Dell to kind of help get a maximized impact of our handprint, so to speak, and get positive impact. So first of all, you have to understand what is your footprint, and that's where the Net Positive Project, and we inspire to be a net positive company where we are giving back more than what our footprint is. And then the second piece is really around what a lot of things that we're doing around precision medicine, and specifically using genomics to diagnose and treat pediatric cancer and other rare childhood disorders that don't get a lot of mainstream funding. And so we've actually done, for the next 4 or 5 years, worked with an organization out of Arizona called TGen to basically use our high-performance computing, our cloud capabilities to really advance the field of how you use genomics to diagnose and treat pediatric cancer. And that's an area where we've kind of, if we have just given cash, so to speak, and not actually done true R&D, we wouldn't have had kind of the impact that we've had so far. And we're now in our 5th FDA trial to the point where now this is a primary form of diagnosis and treatment.
Some pretty solid questions here I'm getting from the audience. Another question here, I'm going to throw this out to both of you. So we're all pretty aware of a variety of societal problems, and we've talked about quite a few of those problems, like yesterday's panel was talking about the political climate right now. We're aware of problems like race and racism, issues that have created a lot of tension in the air, especially these past couple of years. So how does technology actually move the needle with respect to those issues? How can you use technology to somewhat resolve some of those challenges, those problems that we've been faced with, especially in recent years?
Mm-hmm. So I think access to technology is the key. And as an example, kids in Mali, Africa have never seen a laptop before. But immediately they learn how to play with it and interact with their friends. And if they have access to the internet, in theory, they have access to the sum of all human knowledge, right? One click away. And that's very powerful. That can transform a community. It can transform a child. And so I think the most marginalized children in the world who don't have access to technology are left out. And we want to reach every last child. And technology can help us do that.
Well, Jeremy, you want to have?
Yeah, I think, and actually that's interesting because that's one of our largest and kind of long-standing areas that we've invested from a strategic giving perspective is around how do you kind of bridge this digital divide that we see globally? And it looks different based upon region and country. But we believe strongly that if you can enable, for example, in the U.S., more girls to get into computer science, or if in India, use technology to kind of enable more of a base capability around literacy and math, and provide this digital access that Tori is talking about, it then enables this kind of collaboration piece that we've kind of talked about earlier, where once you begin to interact with different cultures and with people with different diversity of backgrounds, I think you begin to kind of, as Gina was talking about, see where your interests are in common, and you begin to kind of rally around common areas of interest and opportunity versus beginning to kind of look at things from kind of a arm's length, or maybe just from an awareness but not an empathy perspective.
I want to take a little moderator's prerogative here just for a second, just
Sure.
to follow up on that. Now, I've had conversations, or I've asked policymakers the same question about, are there any worries or concerns about automation, artificial intelligence, automation? In fact, you have analyst firms like Gartner, for example, they're saying automation is going to be accelerating over the next 5 years.
Right.
So are you worried about some of the social economic displacement that might cause? Is that something that you're preparing for in the corporate sector? Is that something you're preparing for in the nonprofit sector as well?
Yeah, I think it's a key piece in the sense of really, kind of twofold. One is I think it highlights what Tori mentioned, which is how imperative that we bridge this digital divide becomes. Because I think that, as what we'll see because of automation and robotics and those kind of pieces, is that you begin to kind of require more of this kind of digital literacy, and in the kind of the kind of higher creative roles, if you will, that they kind of enable. So I think it kind of number one highlights the need for us to bridge the digital divide. I think secondly, I think what's exciting though is when you look at things like the Internet of Everything and all the connected and the data that we are going to be able to generate, I think that actually provides a lot broader opportunity where you can transform a lot of what data into so what information into knowledge that will then open up new opportunities. And so I think that it's actually kind of, we're going to have a foundation that we can kind of build on for broader growth, and just kind of everything kind of get automated away from our perspective.
Tori, do you have any thoughts on that?
That evokes the term singularity, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're referring to. And I think, sure, there might be some scariness about it because it's unknown, but I think technology, if properly applied, can provide greater efficiency for organizations. And for example, look at driverless cars, right? In the future, there won't be people driving cars. And if they're not driving cars, which is somewhat of a mundane activity, they can be doing, let's say, life-saving work on the ground as a program administrator to save the children, right? And so we would rather see that, the human race evolves so that technology makes us more efficient, so that we can be applied, and our times and our talent can be applied to something more worthy, like life-saving.
Interesting. Want to ask here about one of the earlier. Well, no, there was a question that wasn't asked in the earlier segment, which referenced the expense of technology. Would Tech for Good be able to offer nonprofit discounts, et cetera? That's something that someone's interested in here. I want to get some thoughts on that.
Yeah, we actually do that today in really kind of a few ways. One is there's an organization actually based out of California called TechSoup that specializes in getting technology, even high-end technology solutions specifically for nonprofits. Dell is one of their major kind of vendors within that program. And that really just kind of helps enable just kind of what I'd call base infrastructure, base technology access. And then again, I think that what's so powerful about a lot of the innovation that's happening around cloud and mobility and is that now the kind of very powerful technologies are accessible for, frankly, a few dollars a month when you look at some of those capabilities. And so I think that the barriers to really kind of high-end capabilities have dropped pretty dramatically because of the transformation that Dell and other companies are driving around those technology areas.
You're looking forward to those nonprofit discounts, I'm sure.
Yeah, we are. We really like the suffix "for good,"
right,
and fill in the blank with the technology, so we appreciate it. So that way more money can go to our mission.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. How do we motivate people to work on those issues that aren't like the bling issues, the big glamorous kind of A-list issues that are popular or trending? So how do you get folks to kind of sort of swerve away from that and to work on those issues? And Tori, I want to throw this question out there to you first. I know that could probably be a little frustrating for you in your space, sometimes trying to get people's attention to focus on such as, the issues like in the photograph that you just showed there and in places in like sub-Saharan Africa, for example.
That's a great question, Charles. And there's another photo that I have of a boy who being interviewed in the Reddit Ama right here. And you'll see that one of our frustrations is there isn't a direct correlation between urgency and the public's attention. So for example, a drought is not sensational. It's a slow build emergency until it becomes a disaster, right? And we need to be more creative in storytelling. And so this is an example of Athene the Gamer again visiting our programs in Liberia a couple years back when Ebola was an epidemic and people were paranoid and scared and there were a lot of myths. And the child you see there, Muhammad, age 12 at the time, was an Ebola survivor. And so this is a Reddit Ama, and this connects community. So very similar to the way we're crowdsourcing our questions and watching this in live stream, they conducted a Reddit Ama, Ask Me Anything. And anyone could ask, and they moderated with a staff member in the background for child protection purposes. But this is a great example of a convergence of technology to a child survivor of Ebola. And in fact, the Reddit community, the Reddit moderator, thought that it wasn't even true. So we had to post additional evidence, and here's Muhammad with his certificate of survival, except that he survived Ebola and he was given a medical release, and that's his certificate. So I think it enables those kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We do have this issue of policymakers, lawmakers catching up, governments catching up, and this is not just on one level. A lot of folks would assume it's just on the federal level because of all the gridlock and dysfunction on Capitol Hill, and you can see what's going on with the election. You have it across the board, federal, state, local, and governments, especially let's look at the local level, they're really not keeping pace with the rapid development of technology, especially
right.
Platforms like mobile. So it's really hard to apply for, as one person is asking, or they're making a real solid point here, it's really hard to apply for services using a phone. So how do you change all of that? How do you start to sort of have governments meet, I don't know, the technology sector in the middle, or try to get to where the technology sector is right now?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a few points on that. One is I think that, and I think MCON is a good example of this, is where I think you can make a strong argument that the private sector and the social sector are potentially best positioned to make true change. And so I think that when we talk about technology for good and the access that technology provides, I think it's number one, and kind of an empowering vehicle that allows us here and other organizations to kind of help drive the change that we want. I think the other piece is things like the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has developed that allow kind of us to galvanize around kind of key issues globally, both from a public sector, social sector, and private sector. I think kind of help generate some momentum in key areas with what needs to evolve, but tangible targets. Yeah. I think will help kind of bridge some of those gaps that we see around the public side, basically kind of adopting many of the technologies that are very commonplace for us today on the private and social side.
I notice there's a theme of access in this discussion, and so how do you institutionalize that access? So technology for certain populations of people, whether they be in sub-Saharan Africa or even where I grew up in North Philadelphia, for example, there's a lot of poverty in Philadelphia. It's one of the most hyper-poverty urban areas in the country. So how do you change that? How do you institutionalize access? How do you get governments and also the innovation sector to partner up and try to provide more access for those underserved populations? And Tori, I wanted to get some thought on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, Charles. I think those populations in the future are consumers. Mm-hmm. The more consumers that are educated and connected now, the larger the markets would be later. That's one way to look at it from a for-profit perspective. And from a non-for-profit perspective, I think this public-private partnerships are in the best interest of communities, because then there's less violence, then there's more access to education, And I think there's a lot of cost savings in that transformation that you can apply that everybody wins.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot of opportunity when you look at whether it's mobile phone adoption in India and some developing markets, whether it's some of the kind of e-wallet capabilities within Africa are actually ahead of a lot of the developed countries because they can basically kind of enable more of a leapfrog effect. And so I think that there's an opportunity too to where when you look at technology access, I think there's opportunities in developing markets to actually kind of leapfrog where some of the developed markets are, and you'll actually see adoption innovation faster in those markets than what we may even have here.
Mm-hmm. And how do you, Jeremy, follow-up question here, how do you ensure that the empathy and impact turn into action? So like the last session or segment that we had with Gina Bianchini, she was talking about how you kind of take it from, just amassing followers and having trending hashtag conversations into something that's like a force, a movement, sustainable action. So how do you get into appropriate action? How do you, and we've already talked about the access thing, kind of bridge that with the access conversation that we were having.
Yeah, again, I can't overemphasize, and I think Tori's done a good job of exemplifying it, is around, kind of establishing first that empathy. And again, I think that's where we think technology has one of the biggest impacts. But then when it comes to action, it's really about then how do you begin to evolve from measuring activity, number of dollars, number of volunteers, to actually outcomes and impact. And I think that's where things like the Sustainable Development Goals and other kind of things that galvanize around Dell has a legacy of good that we actually just launched our annual report on, where we have 21 goals that are specific to how we help evolve our communities, how we help the planet, how we kind of help into a more diversified workforce that we measure around every year. And so I think being able to hold yourself accountable, that transparency, and begin to try to evolve from measuring activity to outcomes and impacts, so that then even good or bad, you can kind of show what your progress is and then kind of evolve from there.
Here's another question from the audience. Apart from providing access to technology, what about solution equity? And if the groups that need the tech aren't the ones making it, will it truly serve them? So that seems like a good question for you, Tori, to kind of start off with.
So I do think we ought to be solution-oriented and data-driven. Right, and the only way to innovate is you have to have a tolerance to fail, and fail fast, and learn from it, and iterate. And so I think solution orientation, keeping the end in mind, is important to accelerate innovation.
What about that solution equity? I mean, as far as populations being involved in like creating the technology, being the creators, the innovators themselves, rather than those underserved populations that we've been talking about, or those populations that have trouble with access. What about that? Like, is that something that Dell is looking into as well? How does Dell help drive that?
Yeah, and just briefly as we kind of wrap, I think that the key is that it's not just about kind of throwing notebooks or tablets at kids and saying, hey, congratulations, you've bridged the digital divide. The curriculum and the solutions that we wrap around it are kind of the keys of how we kind of enable more of a holistic, because you have to look at a lot of these problems from a holistic perspective, as far as what their self perspective is. How do you get a social encouragement where they are encouraged to kind of help get into different areas of applied science, et cetera. So I think the holistic approach is key.
All right. I wish we had more time, and we don't. Jeremy Ford, you got the last word. Tori Rossetti, Dell, and also Save the Children. Thanks so much
for
joining us.
Great.
Appreciate it. Thank you.